Story recapped here. Today, I'm going to explain a drama, horror, thriller film called We Are What We Are. This story about a strange family's tradition is adapted from a Mexican film of the same name. Spoilers ahead. Watch out and take care. Family traditions are often honored through generations. But when a tradition turns out to be a dangerous ritual that puts the children's morals to the test, does one's belief trump the family's? Children are still their own individual person with their own wants and beliefs, after all. This is true as well for the Parker sisters, who realize how their family traditions are the wrong path when a family tragedy forces them into a horrible responsibility. In the end, it's up to them to choose between loyalty for family and desire to pave their own path. During a downpour, Emma Parker drives into town to run some errands. She visits a local store to fetch some supplies, but she gets lost in her thoughts as her hand trembles uncontrollably. The store clerk snaps her out of it, and Emma excuses how she is just worried about the damp weather. As she heads back to her car, Emma approaches a poster for a missing teenage girl named Bridget and feels distraught. Suddenly, blood escapes her mouth. Her body weakens as she desperately heads back to her car. Struggling, she falls back and hits her head on a pipe, then falls into a ditch that fills up with water where she drowns. At the Parkers' home, the daughters, Rose and Iris, find their mother's note about heading to town. Their younger brother, Rory, requests snacks, but the sisters refuse, as it is the first day of their abstinence. Instead, Rose gives Rory milk. The sisters worry about their mother, who's been acting strange and suffering headaches for days. Still, their father refuses to take her to the doctor. From his shed, their father, Frank, walks back to the house after repairing a watch. The sisters watch the news about their town's awful weather when they hear police officers talking to Frank outside. News about their mother's demise finally reaches them. As the family gathers at the table and copes with their loss, Frank aggressively scolds his young son when he sneaks cereal in his mouth. The tragedy of losing a loved one can truly challenge someone's mind and heart. The sudden death of their matriarch shadows the family in grief, plunging the children into confusion and Frank into desperation for control. Under these extreme emotions is when many of us make mistakes that may harm our loved ones. Frank's aggression towards Rory sneaking a snack is an example of this, but life doesn't always allow us to press pause during troubled times, so we're forced to move on and do what we're expected to do even when we're not ready. Unable to handle the grief, Frank sends his daughters to Dr. Barrow to identify their mother's body. As legally required, Barrow will be doing an autopsy on Emma's body. Iris volunteers to identify the body, sparing her sister from the grief. That evening, Frank drops to his knees in mourning. His neighbor, Marge, gives him comfort that Emma is now in a better place. Despite being religious, Frank doesn't truly believe in this. Still, he accepts Marge's embrace. At the autopsy room, Dr. Barrow examines Emma's body and discovers signs of Parkinson's disease. During this, Frank insists they carry on with the tradition despite their loss. Since Iris is the eldest daughter, she will be taking over their mother's duties. The conversation is cut when a tree outside falls, and their electricity fails. Iris heads out to report the event to the tenants at their trailer park while Rose lights candles. As the sisters do their duties, Frank comforts his youngest son with a song about Christ. Later that evening, Frank spots a woman having car troubles on an empty road. He parks his truck but hesitates on what he's about to do. Finally deciding, Frank steps out of his truck and grabs a bar wrench from the back. This scene turns our view of Frank's character on its head. From the grieving husband struggling to cope and care for his family, we see him in what seems to be the beginning of a crime. How he comforted Rory during the power outage suggests he's religious, or at least teaching his children to be. But his actions in this scene imply something evil in him. It's the first sign of the Parker family's secrets and how Frank's religion may not be enough to stop him from acts against the Bible that we know. The next day, Frank retrieves a book from under the floor. Rose hears him leave the house, carrying garbage bags. Meanwhile, Barrow picks flowers near the creek when his dog finds bone fragments under a fallen log. Barrow leaves a message for the town sheriff, reporting about the bones he found. He sets the vase of flowers he picked up from the creek in his daughter's bedroom, still wondering where she is. At the police station, the Kimballs report their missing daughter, Valerie. Despite wanting to wait for 24 hours before declaring her missing, Sheriff Meeks empathizes with the parents and prints out missing posters for Valerie. As Frank continues his work at the shed, a sound from a hatch on the floor distracts him. When it quiets down, he throws a handful of receipts and cards into the furnace. He covers the hatch before answering the knock on his door. The family's luck sinks further as one of their only tenants decides to leave town, given how the storm has damaged the area. The tenant gives Frank the remainder of their payment and bids him good luck. Frank is quiet during the conversation and shuts the door when the tenant pays him. Back inside, Frank struggles with his trembling hand. At the house, Rose takes pity on her hungry brother and sneaks him a cup of cereal and milk while she eats a piece of the cereal as well. While the siblings cheat their fasting, Frank gives Marge a brooch to thank her kindness during his grief. Emma's funeral is in the afternoon, and Marge agrees to watch over Rory as he is too young for the sad event. A funeral is a way for the deceased's friends and family to bid them farewell. However, some young children may be too sensitive to part from their departed parent. Much like how Iris, the eldest, spared Rose from seeing their mother's body, now Frank chooses to spare his youngest son the same grief. What Frank failed to do, however, is ask what his children think. Sending Iris and Rose to identify Emma's body instead of taking that responsibility could have shattered their emotions. And Rory may have wanted to say goodbye to his mother, but Frank decides that his son doesn't need to be there. While they prepare for the funeral, Rose worries about Iris taking over Emma's duties in their tradition, suggesting they don't continue with it instead. Iris knows their father won't allow it but promises she'll figure something out after. As she stares at a hair clip from her mother's items, Rose laments how they're different from the others, something Iris has already accepted. While everyone's preparing, Rory sneaks into the basement under his father's shed. Curious, Rory enters a bolted door that opens into a dark hallway. There, he discovers a locked cell where a woman's hand reaches out to him from under the door. Frightened, Rory rushes out, but Frank catches him. Frank is furious at his son, but seeing the fear in his face, he comforts the boy, promising Rory that he'll teach him not to be afraid of the dark. Until then, Rory is forbidden in the shed. Frank takes Rory away, ignoring the muffled cries from the locked cell. Frank's crime and the family's secret go deeper. A captive is in their basement, and from Frank's disregard of her cries, it seems that she isn't the first one. Still, he ignores his anger over Rory's actions and comforts him instead. This shows that Frank does care for his children, no matter the authoritative parenting. Strict parents are sometimes seen as cold towards their children, but most, if not all of them, can still show a more tender way of parenting when it's needed. After all, family comes first, so Frank comforts his son and ignores the other troubled soul locked in the cell. Frank scolds Iris for leaving Rory alone, reminding her of her responsibility to the family. He drives his daughters to the funeral, leaving Rory in Marge's care. Frank leads the prayer for his wife's soul at the funeral. After the funeral, Frank struggles to climb into his car, having not eaten anything since his wife's death. Barrow advises Iris to let her father rest, promising to check in on them soon. Upon arriving home, Frank hands the book he retrieved from under the floor to Iris. The book recounts their family's history, written by their ancestor, Alice Parker. Alice's family suffered from famine one winter, forcing her father and uncle to leave in search of supplies. Iris' reading is interrupted when Officer Anders visits them in the middle of the night. He first expresses sympathy to her family before asking about Valerie Kimball. But Iris claims to not having seen her since the school closed. Valerie's usual route home passes by their house, and Anders hopes someone saw her before she went missing. Anders diverts the conversation into asking Iris out after everything settles down. Iris suggests that he asks her on another day, which he agrees to before leaving. After Anders leaves, Rose asks if he was the boy Iris liked at school, which Iris doesn't deny. She looks back out the window as Anders drives away. While Rose has been vocal about her concerns with the family, Iris assumes her role as confidently as she can. However, the lure of a different life with the man she had feelings for distracts her. Throughout the film, we see Iris assume the responsibility as the eldest child without question. But even people like her, who are dutiful to their family and responsibility, have their own wishes for themselves. Since she feels trapped in her role, Iris can't share her own thoughts to her family and can only entertain the idea of a different life in small moments. Meanwhile, Barrow presents the bone fragment to Meeks at his home. Barrow wants to test the bone to see if it's human, but given the flood, their resources are limited. Barrow's obsession with the fragments leads Meeks to believe that Barrow is grasping at straws, hoping some lead to his daughter's disappearance. While Rose reads him a bedtime story, Rory tells her about the crying monster in their father's shed. Rose dismisses his story and tucks him to bed. Unable to sleep, she takes Iris' book and reads it. The story continues as Alice's father finally returns, bearing fresh meat for them while their uncle continues east, hoping to reach the outpost and get help. The uncle doesn't return for days, however, and Alice believes he won't be returning at all. At present, Iris shares her doubts with her father. She questions how their family is, but Frank insists that God chose to make them this way. If they don't follow God's wishes, their family will perish. Knowing how she's only scared of her tasks, Frank assures her that she's strong enough to do it. Iris has finally expressed her doubts about the family's obscure tradition. But her father is a believer that God chose this path for them, so they must take it. Frank insists that his children believe the same and carry on with their tradition, so Iris complies, putting her faith in her father. This is yet another example of how Frank disregards his children's thoughts and how Iris remains blindly loyal to family. He doesn't listen to her doubts, but instead counters it with his own beliefs. Iris may be used to this encounter and it makes her set aside her own thoughts instead. The next day, Barrow presents the bone fragment to Anders at a local diner. Anders investigates the bone as Barrow suggests that it's from human remains. Barrow states how he shared the information with the sheriff, but Meeks disregarded his ideas. So he continued his investigation on his own, uncovering 30 missing people within a 50-mile radius around their town over the last few years. Anders, however, reminds Barrow that he's only a deputy and cannot help him in this matter. Barrow looks outside the window, seeing Rose and Iris help people even though they recently lost their mother. He worries over the people of their town, believing that they're good folk who don't deserve such tragedies. This sways Anders into agreeing to help the investigation. Later that day, Iris gets Marge's help as Rory develops a fever. Marge assures them that he'll be okay after some medicine and a change of clothes. While the sisters fetch the items for Rory, the young boy grabs Marge's hand and sucks on her thumb like a baby. But he bites her, alarming the woman. Frank arrives, eyeing Marge suspiciously. He sees her out of their house, refusing her advice to take Rory to a doctor. Before Marge leaves, she points out his nose bleeding. He shuts the door on her and falls on the floor. Iris hurriedly wipes the blood away as Frank's hand trembles. He views this as a sign to begin their ritual. In history, trials and tribulations have been viewed as a sign from a higher being. They're either interpreted as a sign of wrath and punishment or a sign of challenging the people's commitment to the faith. Frank clearly chooses the latter. Even with his daughter's doubts, Rory's fever, Marge's suspicions, and his own declining health, Frank just assumes all these worries are signs to test his faith, instead of fixing the problems first. Paying attention to his children more could have saved Iris and Rose from what they're about to do next. Iris and Rose head into the shed as they remember the rest of the story from the book. After Alice's mother passes away, her father's mind deteriorates, leaving her family's survival on Alice's shoulders. She and her brother follow their father into a cave, where their father hands Alice a knife. She turns to the flayed woman bound against the cave walls. Believing that it's God's will, she carries on the mission to save her family, sparking the Parkers' ritualistic tradition, which they call Lamb's Day. While Iris and Rose prepare, a body is found in the lake. Anders helps carry out the body, identifying her as Valerie Kimball. Reaching the cell, Iris unlocks the door but hesitates before opening it. Inside, they find a young woman in chains, hiding under the table. Iris pulls on her chains, but the woman struggles from her pull. Rose cries, unable to bear what they're about to do. Iris begs for her help, reminding her how they're doing this for their family. Rose gives in and helps pull the chains, finally forcing the woman in the open. Kneeling before them, the woman pleads with her eyes, her cries muffled under her bindings. Iris apologizes to the woman, whom she identifies as Mrs. Stratton. Mrs. Stratton attacks Rose in a desperate attempt to escape. Iris swings a hammer at the back of her head, causing the woman to seize in her place. Rose backs away, begging Iris to make her stop. As she exits the cell, Rose spots Rory arriving. Rose quickly gets up and picks him up to spare him from the gruesome event. Iris swings the hammer once more, ending the horrors. The family tradition is finally revealed. Beginning from their ancestors, who suffered famine before turning to cannibalism to survive, the Parker family does the same. They fasted for 2 days to symbolize their ancestors' famine before turning to their captive for sustenance. Many religious rituals from ancient times involved human sacrifices, but the modern world has mostly, if not entirely, relinquished these practices. But the Parker family continues it in secret. It's no wonder why playing a larger role in this tradition is what Iris and Rose dreaded, and now they come to the point of no return. Outside, Marge hears cries from the shed. Inside, Iris weeps, in shock over what she did. Rose collects her sister, pushing her to continue the ritual. They first clean Mrs. Stratton's body, and draw guide marks on the body as they drain the blood. Rose sharpens the ritual blade, and the sisters prepare themselves for the next step. Hours later, the sisters clean themselves from the blood, both are distraught and traumatized. With their eyes red from tears, the girls prepare supper, clad in formal dresses. Iris is still horrified, while Rose is adamant about not doing the ritual again, no matter what their father will say. Iris goes to answer the door, revealing Marge, who offers the family lasagna. She asks about Rory, whom Iris assures is now well. Marge wonders about the cries she heard from the shed, which Iris excuses that it was her father, still grieving for his wife. But Marge insists that she heard a girl crying instead. Iris disregards her concerns and bids the woman good night. At supper, Iris serves the family with a bowl of stew, which Rose stares daggers at. Frank says a thankful prayer before beginning their meal. Frank praises Iris' cooking, which she awkwardly accepts. Rose, however, hesitates on eating the stew. Instead, she chews on a cracker when her father is looking away. The sisters are truly haunted by what their family's tradition forces them to do. It tests both their morale and willpower to continue. While Iris' determination falters, Rose's urge of defiance grows stronger, refusing to eat the fruits of their crime. Sadly, many parental figures ignore their children's woes, believing that they know better. But cornering someone and giving them no other choice can be what forces them to act in desperation. The next day, Anders searches the creek, where they find more remains. Barrow suggests the remains had been boiled before leaving Anders to continue the investigation. From the Parkers' house, Iris and Rose find Anders poking around the creek near their home. Iris asks why he's there, then offers to lend him a pair of dry socks, urging him to head to their house. Before leaving the creek, Anders discovers an old tooth from the water. Inside, Iris helps Anders dry his feet. After reminiscing their romantic history, Anders is convinced to share what he's searching for in the creek. He reveals how the storm washed bones into the water, which Iris suggests might be from deers or raccoons. But Anders shares how Barrow thinks they're human bones, which alarms Iris. When Iris leaves to fetch the socks, Anders composes a message from his phone but is interrupted by Rose. She notices the tooth he sets down on the table, and he casually shares how he found it on the creek. Iris returns and picks up the tooth from the table, examining it. She wonders if the bones might have come from an old family cemetery up the creek, prompting Anders to check it out. Iris offers to lead him there but secretly grabs a switchblade before they leave. When the two are gone, Rose freezes at her father's heavy footsteps. Frank looks out the door, watching Anders and Iris leave. A new obstacle comes the family's way through Anders' investigations. Iris hopes to divert his findings but knows this wouldn't be enough to stop him from digging further. They can't take chances, leaving Iris with a difficult choice to protect her family. Anders, however, is her sign for a different life. This could be the turning point where she must choose, duty for family or hope for a better future. In his office, Barrow examines the bones they've collected so far, noting how they bear marks of two kinds of blades. From his books, he learns that certain signs of Parkinson's disease match another disease known as Kuru, resulting from cannibalism. After investigating the old cemetery, which seems undamaged, Anders picks up some flowers for Iris. But she refuses them, believing she's not worthy of his affection. Overwhelmed with emotions, Iris kisses Anders, and the two become intimate. Their passionate encounter ends when something slams onto Anders' head, spilling his blood onto Iris. Frank kicks Anders off his shovel and commands Iris to return home, which she complies without a fear. Iris only hoped for a sense of normalcy and control. With Anders representing what could have been her life and future, she indulges in the idea and passion. But the truth, and her father, refuses to let her give in, and she's thrust back into the horrors of reality. Frank doesn't allow her to choose for herself, and this kind of parenting often leads to either depression or rebellion from the child. Both options are not healthy, but the Parker family is deep-rooted into their secrets, making it too late to go back. After burying Anders, Frank burns his clothes to get rid of the evidence. His hands tremble again, worrying him. When he gets back home, he angrily dismisses his daughters before Anders' phone starts vibrating from his pocket. Barrow calls both Anders and Sheriff Meeks, hoping to share what he'd found so far. But neither of them answer their phones. That evening, Rose comforts her grieving sister, placing the hair clips she found from their mother's items on Iris' hair. She plans for them to escape their father after he goes to sleep. Outside, Frank takes his anger out on the fallen tree by the creek, chopping it as he says scriptures. He stops when he finds a human jawbone from the trunk. Horrified, he searches the other side of the trunk, uncovering more human bones coming out from the tree. The bones are washed away into the creek, which Frank desperately tries to collect to hide. He screams to the heavens as he fails to get them all. At the police station, Barrow asks for Meeks and Anders but learns that they're not there. He distracts the receptionist with his dog while he searches Meeks' office. Barrow retrieves a gun from Meeks' drawers, then proceeds to the town's fireworks event, searching for Anders and Meeks to no avail. Fueled by his desire to uncover the truth about his daughter's disappearance, Barrow follows his instinct and pushes on with his investigations. But now, none of the officers he trusted can help him. Despite the risks, he takes matters into his own hands and steals the sheriff's gun for the sake of getting closure over his missing daughter. We've seen in other movies how another character would say that this isn't what their deceased loved ones would want for them. But the only person Barrow confided in is already dead. No one can change his mind at this point. Even if this isn't how his daughter would have wanted him to exact justice, it's how Barrow chooses, and his choice is final. In his bedroom, Frank prays to his wife, taking the recent events as a sign that their family must be reunited. During this, Rose steals her father's truck keys. Later, Frank pours their stew for dinner when he hears Anders' phone buzz again. It's a message from Barrow, revealing his suspicions about the Parker family and how he intends to confront them. This pushes Frank further into committing to his plans. He takes a bottle from the cupboard and pours the content into the stew. The siblings arrive and help their father set the table, where Rose notices the spilled white powder next to their stew and the bottle of arsenic from their cupboards. Knowing what Frank has done, Rose tries to warn Iris quietly but fails to do so in front of their father. Frank leads the prayer, unaware of the tension between his daughters. His prayer hints at his detachment from the world, further proving Rose's suspicions. Rose observes her siblings, waiting for the right moment to warn them. Seeing Rory about to take a bite, Rose slaps the bowl off his table. With all the challenges they face, Frank has given up hope and attempts to kill himself and his children so they can be reunited in heaven with his wife. In his mind, death may be a better option than their secrets revealed to the town, with Barrow getting so close to the truth. Yet again, he forces his own choice onto his children, even going as far as choosing their deaths. Here, we can see that Frank never saw his children as individuals, but only as a means to continue the family's ways. When their tradition is on the verge of being exposed and stopped, his children's lives become expendable. Fortunately, Rose figures out his plans and refuses to let her father make the choice for them. Before Frank and Iris can question her actions, there's a knock on the door. Iris answers it and allows Barrow inside. Frank tells his children to leave to give him and the doctor some privacy. As the children prepare to leave, the power returns, making Frank chuckle. While Iris cleans the table, Barrow stares thoughtfully at her hair clip. Once alone, Barrow asks Frank about his hand tremor, but he ignores the question. Barrow brings up Anders, whom Frank confesses to having seen this morning but insists that he left. Barrow, then, brings up his findings that Emma suffered from a disease that resulted from eating human flesh. Alarmed, Frank gets up but sits back down when Barrow points Meek's gun at him. Tired of the fake pleasantries, Barrow interrogates Frank about his missing daughter. He points out Iris' hair clip, which is the same one Barrow gave to his daughter before she went missing. Point blank, Barrow asks if they ate his daughter. Frank changes the topic to religion as he puts back his box of matchsticks in the kitchen drawer, right next to his hidden gun. Frank reaches for the gun, then quickly fires at Barrow, but Iris steps in, shielding the doctor from the bullet. Barrow shoots back at Frank, causing him to fall and hit his head on the corner of the kitchen counter. The conflict allows Rose and Rory to escape. Barrow checks on Frank, assuming that he's dead, then he comforts the injured Iris. But Frank appears behind him, hitting Barrow with a frying pan. Disoriented, Frank leaves Iris to chase after Rose and Rory. Emotions run high as secrets are unveiled. The two fathers are adamant on protecting or honoring their children, but the siblings can also make their choice for themselves. Iris chooses to save Barrow's life, unable to accept another death at the hands of her family. On the other hand, Rose focuses on saving herself and her brother. For both sisters, their loyalties lie in their family and not in their sadistic tradition. Iris risks her life to preserve what little humanity there's left for her father and her family, while Rose wants to save her life and her brother's innocence. Both are noble causes that Frank, even on the verge of death, continues to refuse. Rose hurries Rory into the truck just as Frank steps out of the house. The truck fails to work, forcing Rose to abandon it before their father reaches them. The two hurry to Marge's house, begging the woman to let them in. Startled, Marge climbs out of bed and lets them in while her dog leaves the house as they enter. Rose clutches to her brother, hysterical and unable to explain the situation. They hear Marge's dog whimper outside, alerting them. Marge checks the window, which breaks as Frank grabs Marge. When Marge gets free, she bears a wound around her neck. Bleeding out, she falls to the floor, leaving the siblings at the mercy of their father. Frank stumbles inside, beckoning Rory to join him. Rose whimpers as the boy joins him. With Rory in his arms, Frank extends his hand to Rose. She refuses at first but is convinced upon hearing that Iris needs her. Despite freedom seemingly at hand, Rose still succumbs to fear. She freezes at her father's presence, allowing her younger brother to return to him. She still wishes to be free, but knowing both her siblings need her, Rose relents and joins her father. Up until tonight, Frank raised them using fear and authority, which made Iris and Rory compliant. We've seen Rose being the rebellious daughter, but even she can't shake her fear towards Frank. And so, she's forced to rejoin him. Back at their home, the siblings gather around the dining table. Frank picks up Rory's discarded plate and fills it with the poisoned stew in front of the boy. Rose stifles her cries as Frank serves Iris the stew. When he turns to Rose, he stares at her crying face, seeing her mother's face in her. Frank hugs his younger daughter, comforting her. Rose says she loves him before biting down his neck, surprising her siblings. Iris stabs Frank's hand while Rory hides under the table. Iris joins in, biting on her father's arm while Iris feasts on the other. The sisters continue to eat their father's raw flesh until finally, he stops moving. The girls stare at each other, surprised at what they'd done. Seeing Barrow regain consciousness from the side of the room, Rose kneels before him and returns his daughter's hair clip. With the sun rising, the siblings drive out of town, finally free from their family's horrifying tradition. On Rose's lap, Rory sleeps next to Alice's book, keeping their family's history of cannibalism close. The Parker family has been troubled for generations, beginning with Alice being forced to carry out a murder to feed her siblings. This highlights the question of what someone can do for the sake of their family. Frank is devoted to their family's ways, believing that it's what God wants and, by following it, will grant them blessings. Even after the many struggles that fall to them, from Emma's death to their secrets threaten to be revealed, Frank holds on to his belief. Otherwise, what have their sacrifices been for? Iris and Rose choose differently, however. The young women seek another path they can take. Much like many young people, they struggle with a choice of following in their family's footsteps or seeking a different road to take. Iris, most of all, struggled with this choice. Her devotion to family keeps her planted despite questioning the morality of their actions. But her father's continued crimes open her eyes, and so she helps Rose carve a path for them instead. The irony of the girls performing the ritual of devouring human flesh to escape from it is not lost in them. Still, if this is what it takes for them and their brother to survive, the sisters do what they must, much like how Alice Parker did for her family. Subscribe to watch more videos like this. Turn on notifications. And leave a like, it really helps the channel out. Thank you for watching.